Martin Luther. We all know the name, right? The guy who took on the entire Holy Roman Empire with basically just a pen and his conscience. But here's the thing. What happens when a revolution starts to eat itself? Today, we're going to dive into the brutal, bloody crisis that almost destroyed the Reformation from the inside out, and the absolutely savage choice Luther had to make to save it.
Smite, slay, and stab. I mean, listen to those words. You'd think they came from some brutal warlord or a mad king. But no, those words were written by Martin Luther himself. They're violent, they're shocking, and for 500 years they've haunted his legacy because they seem to fly in the face of everything he stood for.
So, that's the big question, isn't it? How did the man who preached about the freedom of the Christian soul end up calling for the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of peasants? To even begin to understand this, we have to look at the absolute chaos his own revolution unleashed.
Look, when Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that church door, he kicked open a door to a new world, but he had absolutely no idea what was about to come rushing through. His call for religious reform quickly spiraled into this political and social firestorm that he never intended and frankly couldn't control.
Luther basically saw the threats to his Reformation as three biblical monsters, each one more terrifying than the last. First, you had Behemoth. These were the rival theologians, the other thinkers who challenged his reading of the Bible. Then came Leviathan, radical religious sects that took his ideas to extremes that honestly terrified him. And finally, the Great Waters, a massive tidal wave of social revolution that threatened to drown all of Germany in blood.
You see, Luther wasn't the only game in town. As his ideas spread like wildfire, other powerful thinkers popped up. And believe me, not all of them were on his team. His movement started to fracture almost as soon as it began.
Sometimes a single word can split a continent. Over in Switzerland, another major reformer, a guy named Ulrich Zwingli, had a huge problem with Luther's view on the Lord's Supper. Luther was adamant. When Christ said, "This is my body," he meant it literally. But Zwingli said, no, he meant, "This signifies my body." Now, this sounds like splitting hairs, but it came from two totally different ways of seeing the world. For Luther, flesh meant the sinful human heart. For Zwingli, it meant the physical body. And this one single disagreement created a whole rival Reformation, making any kind of united Protestant front completely impossible.
And then came the real radicals, the Anabaptists. These guys took Luther's ideas about restoring early Christianity and ran with them, literally. They rejected baptizing infants, refused to serve in government, and were total pacifists. To Luther, this was just horrifying. He saw it as a new kind of monk-like thinking, an attempt to create a perfect little society on earth by abandoning all worldly duties. In his mind, rejecting the authority of the state was a direct path to total anarchy.
And this brings us to that third monster, the Great Waters. You have to understand, the Peasants' War didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Peasant revolts had been brewing for 100 years over insane taxes and feudal lords taking away their rights. On top of that, you had these wild astrological predictions saying 1524 was going to be a year of total chaos. The whole situation was a powder keg. Luther didn't build it, but his talk of Christian freedom? Yeah, that was the match that lit the fuse.
And every fire needs a firebrand to really get it going. Enter Thomas Müntzer. He was a radical preacher who basically saw himself as the true voice of the Reformation. He took Luther's ideas and turned them into weapons, calling Luther a sellout and a coward, a Dr. Pussyfoot who was cozying up to the same princes who were bleeding the people dry. Müntzer started preaching a holy war, a violent uprising where the peasants would slaughter the rich and build God's kingdom on earth. For Luther, this guy was the devil incarnate.
So with Müntzer fanning the flames, the whole German countryside just exploded into violence. Now, at first, Luther actually tried to play the peacemaker. He really did sympathize with the peasants' problems, but he condemned their rebellion, begging both sides to just calm down and work it out.
And you know, what's amazing is that if you look at their initial demands, the 12 Articles, they were surprisingly reasonable. They wanted to choose their own pastors, get rid of serfdom, have fair rents, a lot of stuff Luther himself had talked about. In fact, he agreed that their complaints were totally justified. But, and this is the crucial part for him, they were threatening to use violence to get what they wanted. For Luther, rebellion was the ultimate sin, a direct attack on God's established order.
And pretty soon his worst fears were realized. The whole thing just descended into total anarchy. Roaming mobs of peasants were pillaging castles, burning monasteries, and drinking so much stolen wine it was actually called a wine war. This wasn't an organized revolution, it was a chaotic mess. And when Luther himself went out to try and reason with them, he was met with mockery and threats of violence. He saw his dream of an orderly reformation turning into an absolute blood-soaked nightmare.
And that was it. That was the turning point. He was humiliated, he was terrified of the chaos he was seeing, and he saw the influence of his archdevil Munzer everywhere. All that talk about moderation just vanished. Luther picked a side, and he picked it hard, writing a furious pamphlet that would change his reputation forever.
Luther's whole argument here was that a rebel has placed themselves outside of God's law. So to kill a rebel wasn't murder, it was an act of public service. It's just like he said when you have to kill a rabid dog. You don't do it because you're cruel, you do it to stop the madness from spreading and killing everyone else. With this tract, he gave the princes the perfect theological justification they needed to unleash absolute, unrestrained brutality.
So Luther chose order over revolution. And in a way, he saved his Reformation from being completely swallowed by anarchy. But the price of that order? Well, it was staggering, both in human lives and for the future of his own movement.
100,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's the estimated number of peasants who were slaughtered by the prince's armies. Armed with better weapons, and now with Luther's blessing, they just crushed the rebellion with merciless efficiency. It was one of the single bloodiest events in German history.
The fallout from this was just catastrophic for everyone involved. The peasants' hopes for a better life completely annihilated. They were rendered powerless, basically hornless oxen for the next 300 years. Catholic rulers, meanwhile, used the war as the perfect excuse to crack down on all Protestants, stopping the Reformation dead in its tracks in their lands. And as for Luther, he lost the trust of the common people, and from then on, his Reformation became much more conservative, tied directly to the authority of the state princes.
After the war, as you can imagine, Luther got savage from all sides. Before, he was seen as a friend of the common man. Now, Catholic propaganda depicted him as the warmonger who started the whole bloody mess. And the peasants, they drew cartoons of him as a double-tongued hypocrite, a traitor who had sold them out to the princes. He was completely caught in a crossfire that he himself had created.
In the end, Luther faced an impossible choice: total anarchy or brutal tyranny. He chose what he believed was the lesser evil. He saved his theological revolution for sure, but you have to wonder if he sacrificed its soul to do it. And this leaves us with the huge, unresolved question that still hangs over his legacy. In his desperate bid to preserve order, did Martin Luther create a church of the people, or did he just create a new church of the state?